Elections, divisiveness, and social media. I'm Jackie Elmer. Welcome to lowertoxiclife.com. This is actually part 2 of my video where I wanted to share some details with you about elections, specifically taking a social media break and really quieting your mind, calming your body, and some ideas to think of as we navigate this crazy election season. If you haven't watched part 1, I will link it in the show notes below. That gives you some overall things that you can do to take care of your mind and your body, staying healthy. But these are just some ways that you can navigate social media, the election cycle, and show up in the best way possible for yourself and for others. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so and grab my guide over at lowertoxiclife.com. All right, so here we are in the election cycle here in the United States. And for the most part, we go through this every 2 years, certainly, and then every 4 years on a big, wider scale. And the reality of it is, in this climate, coming into November of 2024, it's probably the most divisive election that we've ever experienced here in the United States, at least the most divisive that I can remember. And I've been on the planet quite a number of years. I've been voting for decades. And what I really want to remind you of is we are probably more alike than we are divided. And one of the things that I learned, especially starting in 2020, with the thing that shall remain nameless that took over the entire world, if it bleeds, it leads. Now, we've known that for a long time, but if you are addicted to the news feed, mainstream media, corporate media, and even social media, you will find that it is most often doom and gloom. And that's certainly known in journalism in general. If it bleeds, it leads. And so most often the stories that you're going to find delivered into your inbox or into your news feed or your social media feed are going to be those things that get the click, because most of us understand clickbait. If you're on Twitter or X at all, which I am, I recently got back in there because I find it the best news source to be able to look at both sides and measure my own BS meter, as I like to call it, and figure out really where the best area of the truth lies. And the reality of it is, it isn't on this side and it isn't on that side. And if you're only ever reading headlines, and especially those headlines put out by corporate mainstream media, you're always only going to hear one side of the story, whichever side that you're on. So one of the first things that I want to really encourage you is to remember all of us have gut intuition, and we have what I like to call a BS meter, right? Our BS meter, where we can see something and think, I don't know. I'm going to apply some systems of logic and BS to what it is exactly that I'm hearing. Now, one thing that I know for sure is that if you really want to be fair and balanced, to use a term that I don't necessarily love, but I think it does drive home a point that all of us want to be educated, and most of us don't want to look like idiots when we're out there. And so the first thing I want to ask you is, if you're going to be actually yourself posting out on social media and sharing your views, ask yourself, what is my number one goal with this social media post? Am I out there posting about things that are political to get it off my chest, to vent? Or do I really think I'm going to change other people's minds? Because one thing that I've learned, and especially over the last 4 to 8 years, is that most people have already made up their mind. They've already decided. And so often when they see something that goes against what their belief system already is, they're most often not open to the possibility. So one of the things that I always ask myself, and I'm not perfect, I've certainly gotten involved in some back and forth, tit for tat fighting over political ideals, values, what matters most, et cetera. And at the end of the day, most often, you don't win. You may win in your own mind, but for the most part, I don't know that I've ever completely swayed somebody else. Although I did once get an apology after a 30+ year friend told me I was watching too much of one news source, which I wasn't, told me this, told me that, unfriended me, and then ultimately refriended me made a phone call and apologized when she realized what I was sharing, which quite frankly had to do with the military and most specifically the Marine Corps, of which my son is part of. And that is one of my heartfelt, most driving things is what goes on because my son is still actively a Marine and actively involved in a high security clearance type of position. And so I stay very acutely and keenly aware. And I'll be honest, it does sway a lot of my voting as long as he's still in the military, because my number one goal, honest to God, in everything that I do is to make sure that he gets out. He gets out with his mind intact. He gets out with his limbs intact and his overall health and well-being intact. And that's a big, lofty goal. I realize I don't control any of that. But as a mom, I think you probably know what I mean. So what I've learned is at the end of it, anytime I try to, first of all, enact what I call the 24-hour rule. If somebody texts me, emails me, or I see a social media post that literally lights me up or triggers me, one of the first things that I do is I take a pause. I choose to act over time versus react. And so I have what I call a 24-hour rule. I will sit on something for 24 hours if it really triggers me. And I've sat on something for as long as 72 hours, a week, months even, when I'm not quite ready to lower my own temperature gauge and not come back in a way that's ugly, divisive, finger pointing, or in any way makes me later look back and think, wow, I wish I would have handled that differently. And I think all of us have those times in our lives. We have those situations where we've dealt with something where we look back on it and we think, wow, maybe I wish I would have handled that a little differently. And if I had it to do over again, I would do it somewhat differently. Now, I read a great book a year or so ago by Matt Taibbi. If you're not familiar with Matt, he was a long-term writer for Rolling Stone magazine. He leans, or did anyway, he's much more center now, but he leans more on the liberal side in the past. And he wrote a book called Insane Clown President, which quite frankly, he wrote mostly about Donald Trump and his run for presidency in 2016. And it's a very interesting book to read, regardless of whether you love Donald Trump or can't stand Donald Trump. It's really a good book that gives you some insight into how the media handles elections, how the media handles going out on these press tours and different things, following campaigns around. And you learn a lot about groupthink and how opinions are formed and how the narrative is formed for all of us on the receiving end of the news. I have learned to follow Matt and listen to a lot of what he says because I've watched him over time. He was also one that Elon Musk called on as part of the Twitter files. If you have followed any of that part of the Twitter files, when Elon bought out Twitter, renamed it X, and then brought in Matt Taibbi. I think it was Michael Schellenberger and Barry Weiss. I believe those were the three primary ones to come in and uncover the veil of the censorship that was going on with Twitter. Now, I'm not going to get into all of that, but if you followed that at all, which I did because I was curious more than anything. I wasn't a huge user of Twitter or X, and I'm still not, but I do find that I can most often get different sides of the story, use my own BS meter, weigh it up against logic or illogic, and decide for myself where I'm going to fall in my belief system with a lot of that. And so it's been interesting. And then I recently attended the Rescue the Republic event that was held in Washington, D.C. in September of 2024, RFK Jr. It was really about creating more of a unity and eliminating the divisiveness. And for me, as a health coach and somebody who's absolutely passionate about mental health, physical health, nutrition, the food that we feed our children, the food, the way the FDA and CDC and all of those big alphabet soups have really not served us well as U.S. citizens. That's a whole nother rant. But I was there really for that perspective. I've been a RFK Jr. fan since 2000, early 2000s, somewhere around 2006, 7, 8, when he took on Monsanto and sued them. And I was following that. I was living in California. I was aware of what was going on with genetically modified foods, the ultra processed foods. I was already very well aware of that. And on top of that, because I'm such a health fanatic, and a lot of that I can say thanks to my mom who raised me that way. So I actually attended that event. It was really a fabulous event because across the board, there were people of all different parties, all different ideologies, all different beliefs, but mostly who had come together to say, we want freedom of speech. We want clean bodies. We want clean food. We want to clean up the toxic soup that we're raising our kids in, that we're living in. And we want to start the trajectory going back up of the life expectancy for, if nothing else, our children. And so it was an amazing event to be at. But Matt was one of my favorite speakers there when he really shared what his journey of transformation and paying attention to the divisiveness that the media puts forth, and certainly all the political parties. I mean, I have to say, when I came away from that event, I kind of said, I feel like somebody stole Santa Claus. I feel like everything I ever believed in has, had the layers pulled away. And I'm not really a fan of either party anymore. I'm not a two-party fan, and I don't want to make this political. That's a whole nother conversation. But my point is, with this whole thing with elections and the divisiveness, I want to really encourage you to lower your own meter of being triggered by different things. I've learned to come at everything from a curiosity and compassionate stance to try and understand better. If somebody believes differently than me, votes differently than me, the last thing I want to do is shame them, point my finger at them, and tell them that they are wrong, because I don't walk in their shoes. I have not lived their life experience. I'm not currently living it, and I don't know what's gone on in their life to lead them to the point of being where they are. I know for me, just like I shared, one of my huge passions is getting my son out of the military as intact as I can. And so I am paying close attention to the potential for World War III and all the things that are going on. That is a deep, driving, gut-wrenching thing for me as a mom. Now, somebody who's not experiencing that, but maybe has experienced something different, that's voting differently than me based on something else, I'm not going to try to tell them that they have to take on my beliefs and my number one goal. I've already mentioned health and the well-being of our own bodies as well as our children, and correcting so much that's wrong out there, which is why I started my podcast, Lower Toxic Life, because I realized how confused and overwhelmed people are with all the toxins that surround us. I was very fortunate that I was raised by a mom way before her time. I didn't grow up with fluoride. I didn't grow up going to the doctor. I didn't raise my kids with antibiotics or any of that type stuff. And again, that's a whole nother conversation. And I'm not trying to tell people they should follow my beliefs. But when you grow up a certain way and you have your own health and you have ideals and you have experiences and you have your own body hacking and your own proof for different things that work for you, it's easy to see why we each have those own beliefs. So I'm just here to share my perspectives. And speaking of that, perspective is a great word. So as we're out there navigating social media and navigating all of the things that are out there, what I want to encourage you to do, again, is to remember, you have a perspective, I have a perspective, and everyone around you has a perspective as well. And the best that we can do is remember, at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, most of us want to be reunited in unity. Most of us truly want to come from that place of love and compassion and understanding. And we want to know that we would rally together to protect each other, to help each other, no matter what. I reflect back on everything that's gone on in North Carolina after the devastating effects of Hurricane Helene. And I look at that and I think, I'm pretty sure with especially the retired military, the volunteer, like the United Cajun Navy, and so many of those amazing former military personnel who put together those huge organizations and, quite frankly, do far better than FEMA. FEMA definitely plays a role. I've dealt with FEMA personally back in California with wildfires and evacuations and damage. So I know firsthand what it's like to deal with FEMA, and they're a government bureaucracy. They're doing the best they can with what they have to work with and what they're allowed to do. But the reality of it is they're never going to come into a situation and be able to just take it over and manage it in the same way that people who deal with that in those locations all the time can. So the best they can do is figure out how to work together, develop some protocols, and have so many people stop being so bogged down with who's in charge and who's running it. It's more important to get people the help that they need. And so my point with that is, I'm pretty sure, if you're reaching down a hand to pull somebody out of a raging river that's carting you away, or rescuing somebody in your boat who's standing on the rooftop, I'm just reflecting on, the devastating scenes that most of us have witnessed through the videos in North Carolina. I doubt that the first thing you ask is, which way do you vote? Do you vote red or do you vote blue? I'm guessing that's not what most people do. And so I always try to remind myself of that, is who do I want to be at the end of the day? How do I want to show up in love and compassion and leadership? And so that's really what I wanted to share with you to begin with, in terms of elections, divisiveness, social media, managing our own triggers. And now is a perfect time, honestly, to take a social media break. Take a social media break if you need to. Life is going to go on. Years ago, we didn't have social media and elections came and went. Secrets were out there. Most of us, especially in the US, don't believe any longer in the single lone gunman theory of Oswald, who killed Kennedy. Most of us truly believe today that our own government was responsible for that the CIA, their hands are dirty. And when you think about it, there's no other reason why over 60 years later, they haven't released those files, except that we know that it's going to shed some light. And for some reason, kind of like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, the movie, where he said, which is probably the most stunning line of all time, "You can't handle the truth." Well, I beg to differ. I think we can handle the truth. Most of us have steeled ourselves to know that our government lies to us. People lie to us. Lies are told all the time. Mainstream media lies to us. Hollywood lies to us. Our friends and neighbors lie to us. We tell lies. It's just the way that it goes. And I'm sorry that that's the way life is, but I've come to terms with that's the way life is. So I think we can handle the truth. But all that to say, now is a great time to take a social media break. Now is a great time to really think for yourself, what is this doing to me when I get my guts all torn up, when I get my anxiety high? It raises my cortisol, which screws up our hormones, especially as women. It disrupts our sleep. It makes us retain weight. I mean, it leads to so many damaging things. And most people say, most doctors, some of the medical studies out there say the number one reason people go to the doctor is ultimately stress related to begin with. We know that so much of our chronic disease today and weight loss has a lot to do with stress and anxiety and cortisol and the way that we hang on to that in our bodies. So I just really want to encourage you to think about the best way that you can show up for yourself, the best way that you can show up for your family and your children, the best way you can show up for your coworkers, for your neighbors, for your friends, for all of that. What is the best way that you can show up for yourself to eliminate your own election anxiety, to think about what's the worst that can happen, but to also plan for the worst? And if you haven't watched my video, which I'll link it here, on how to prep for disasters and emergencies, I talk about that with the elections too. Here in the United States, there are predictions that there will likely be rioting, disruption, some closures, different things like that. whichever side wins. And we've also braced ourselves to realize we probably won't know the next day what the results are. We possibly won't know the next week or even at the end of the month. And if you think back to what year was it, 2000? When was it 2000, I think maybe 2000 or 2004, one of those two election years when it took a long time when things got hung up. I believe it was the state of Florida. Anyway, all that to say, prepare your mind, prepare your surroundings, just be prepared and know that at the end of the day, we've got each other's back. We're all here together in this human experience, and we're all hoping for the very best. So that's what I had to share with you. I'm going to leave some other links here below of other videos that you can watch for some different things that you can do to prepare your body with water, nutrition, sunlight, those type things. So be sure to watch that video. And then also the one on how to prep for emergencies and disasters. I'm Jackie Elmer, lowertoxiclife.com. Grab my guide to learn more.